What if the system you spent your whole life defending suddenly turned against you? Malcolm Greaves, a seasoned federal prosecutor, thought he understood justice, until the night he was pulled over for a crime he didn't commit. Framed, silenced, entrapped in a game far bigger than himself, he must fight not just for his freedom, but for the truth. But in a world where power protects itself, how do you expose corruption when the whole system is built to bury it? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Malcolm Greaves placed his napkin on the table and signaled for the check. The meal had been excellent, as always, but the moment of indulgence was over. He reached for his wallet as the waiter approached, sliding the leather bill holder onto the table with a courteous nod. "Everything was perfect, Mr. Greaves?" the waiter asked, collecting the empty plate. "Always," Malcolm replied, offering a faint smile. He tucked a few bills inside, leaving a generous tip, then rose from his seat. The restaurant hummed with the soft clinking of glasses and low murmurs of conversation. The warm, familiar scent of grilled beef and garlic butter lingered in the air as he made his way toward the door. Stepping outside, he adjusted his tie and inhaled the crisp night air. The streets of downtown Atlanta were quieter now, the rush of the evening crowd giving way to the steady rhythm of distant traffic. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. 2 missed calls. He frowned slightly, recognizing the number, his colleague at the U.S. Attorney's office. It could wait until morning. Rounding the corner, he spotted his car, a sleek black Chrysler 300, parked under the glow of a street lamp. He clicked the key fob, the headlights flashing in response. The streets of Maplewood District were quiet at this hour. It was a residential neighborhood, well-kept lawns, modest homes, the occasional flickering porch light. As Malcolm navigated the winding roads, he noticed the distinct glow of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A second later, the blare of a police siren shattered the silence. His hands tightened around the wheel. A traffic stop? That didn't make sense. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. There was no broken taillight. Still, he pulled over. Through his side mirror, he saw 2 officers exit the squad car. One was tall, broad-shouldered, walking with a deliberate confidence. Sergeant Roy Beckett. The other was younger, slightly hesitant in his movements. Officer Ethan Doyle. Malcolm rolled down his window as Beckett approached. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Beckett shined his flashlight directly into Malcolm's face. His tone was firm but edged with something else, an undertone Malcolm had encountered before. "License and registration." Malcolm complied, retrieving the documents from his glove compartment. Beckett examined them, then looked at Malcolm for a long moment, as if searching for something more. "This your car?" Malcolm arched an eyebrow. "It is." Beckett glanced at Doyle, then back at Malcolm. "We got a BOLO on a black Chrysler 300 suspected of being involved in a narcotics operation. Your vehicle matches the description." A slow burn of irritation flickered in Malcolm's chest, but he kept his voice even. "That's a coincidence. This is a company-issued vehicle from the Department of Justice." Beckett smirked, unconcerned. "Step out of the car." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I'd like to know exactly what you're accusing me of before I step out." Beckett's voice hardened, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. Doyle shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Malcolm knew this drill. He had prosecuted cases involving unlawful stops before. He had stood before juries and outlined the exact playbook being run against him now. Yet here he was, on the receiving end of it. He exhaled, unclipped his seatbelt, and stepped onto the pavement. "Hands on the hood." He turned, resting his palms on the warm metal of his car's hood. The next thing he felt was Beckett's hands gripping his wrists, then a sharp twist. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. Cuffs. A beat of silence. The quiet hum of cicadas. Then Malcolm said, "You're making a mistake." Beckett leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only Malcolm to hear. "No, Mr. Greaves, you are." He gave the cuffs an extra click, tightening them just enough to bite. Doyle shifted beside him, glancing between his partner and Malcolm. His expression wavered for the briefest moment, but he didn't speak up. Beckett turned to the radio clipped to his vest. "Suspect in custody. en route to Fulton County. Suspect. The word landed like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. They weren't interested in asking questions. Malcolm was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car. As the doors slammed shut, he caught his reflection in the window. The flashing red and blue lights distorted his face, making his features look unfamiliar. And that's when it hit him. They had no idea who they'd just put in cuffs. The air inside Fulton County Detention Center was thick with the scent of sweat, cheap disinfectant, and something metallic. Blood, perhaps, or the lingering residue of old violence. The walls, a dull shade of off-white, felt as lifeless as the faces of the officers moving through the halls. Malcolm Greaves had walked through many holding cells in his career, but never as an inmate. He stood in line with a handful of other detainees, waiting as one officer at the desk logged their information while another collected belts, shoelaces, and personal belongings. The man in front of him reeked of alcohol and slurred curses at the officers processing him. A younger kid behind Malcolm shifted nervously, his hands trembling as he held out his wallet. Malcolm was silent, observing. The metal cuffs had left deep red indentations on his wrists. Not from struggling, he knew better than that, but from how tightly they'd been fastened. "Hands!" an officer barked. Malcolm held them out. The man snapped a rubber glove onto his hand and began patting him down, roughly, deliberately. He could feel the eyes of the other detainees on him. He wasn't dressed like them. His crisp white shirt, though now slightly wrinkled, still spoke of a man accustomed to order, to control. But there was no control here, not for him. Once processed, they led him to a holding cell, small, overcrowded, and humming with the quiet, restless energy of men who had learned to keep their heads down. The metal bench along the wall was cold as he sat down. No one spoke to him, but he felt their glances, brief, assessing. A man like him didn't end up here often. That was what gnawed at him the most. Not the indignity of being treated like a criminal, not even the discomfort of the cell. It was the realization that the very system he had spent decades upholding could consume anyone, innocent or not, with terrifying ease. And tonight it had chosen him. The door to the cell creaked open. "Greaves!" Sergeant Roy Beckett stood there, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His uniform was crisp, his stance relaxed, the posture of a man who believed he had won. Malcolm didn't move right away. He took his time standing up, stepping out of the cell with measured, deliberate movements. They led him to an interrogation room, plain, sterile, with only a metal table and 2 chairs. Beckett sat across from him, fingers tapping the table's surface. "You know," Beckett said, his voice smooth, almost conversational, "I pegged you as someone different. Thought you were one of those straight arrow types, always following the rules." Malcolm said nothing. Beckett leaned forward, the fluorescent light overhead casting sharp shadows on his face. "But I've been in this job long enough to know. Everyone's dirty, one way or another." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "That's so." Beckett's smirk widened. "That's so." He let the silence stretch, as if waiting for Malcolm to fill it. But Malcolm had been in too many interrogation rooms to fall for the bait. Beckett chuckled under his breath. "See, guys like you get comfortable, think you're untouchable. Maybe you got sloppy. Maybe someone decided it was your turn to take a fall." Malcolm held his gaze unblinking. "And which one do you think it is?" Beckett's smirk faltered just for a second. "Just enough." He pushed back from the table, standing. "Doesn't really matter, does it? You're here now." Malcolm let the words settle before speaking. "And you think that's going to last?" Beckett's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked out. The door hadn't even fully closed before Officer Ethan Doyle appeared in the doorway, hesitation written all over his face. Unlike Beckett, Doyle wasn't comfortable in this. He wasn't smirking, wasn't playing a game. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say something. Then he swallowed, clenched his jaw, and followed Beckett out. That was the first crack. The next morning, Malcolm was led into another room, this one with a chair, a stack of papers, and a man who looked too young to be wearing a suit that serious. Hi," the man said, adjusting his tie. "I'm Leo Dunn. I was assigned to your case." Malcolm studied him. Leo couldn't have been more than 30, maybe 32. His suit was well pressed, but slightly ill-fitted, the kind a young lawyer bought when he finally started making enough money to afford something better than off the rack. His hands twitched as he gathered his papers. Leo hesitated, then pushed forward. I'm gonna do everything I can to help you, but I have to be honest. This, this is a tough case. Malcolm arched an eyebrow. Is it? Leo let out a nervous chuckle. Well, yeah. The charges... Malcolm leaned back, watching him. Do you know who I am? Leo blinked. I mean, yes. I have your name, obviously, but... Malcolm didn't answer right away. He considered the young lawyer for a moment, then decided. No, he said finally. You don't. Leo frowned, but before he could ask, an officer entered the room. You get one call. Malcolm nodded, standing. They led him to a wall-mounted phone, thick and scratched with years of use. He dialed a number he knew by heart, one that belonged to someone who could pull him out of this mess. The line rang twice before clicking. Hello? The voice on the other end was sharp, professional. Malcolm exhaled. It's me. I need... The call cut off. Silence. A dial tone. Malcolm stared at the receiver. Someone had killed the line. He replaced the phone on the hook, his expression unreadable. There was no mistake now. Someone wanted him to stay in this cell. Malcolm sat in the holding cell, hands resting on his lap, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on him. He had been here before, on the other side of the table. He had seen men walk into courtrooms knowing the system was already stacked against them. He had argued cases against those very men, and now he was about to become one of them. The guard tapped on the bars. Time to go. The sound of the cell door unlocking sent a ripple through the room. The other detainees barely looked up, too accustomed to the revolving door of injustice. Malcolm stood, adjusting his posture as if he were about to walk into a courtroom as a prosecutor rather than a defendant. As he was led down the corridor, the sterile lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long, stretched-out shadows. Every footstep echoed through the hall, a steady drumbeat leading him toward whatever fate had been arranged for him. He had no illusions. This wasn't about justice. This was about control. The Fulton County Courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its stone pillars imposing, indifferent. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the kind that always preceded a trial where the outcome was already decided. Leo Dunn sat beside him at the defense table, his fingers twitching slightly as he shuffled through his notes. Malcolm could sense the nervous energy radiating off the young attorney. Across the aisle, Ada Connor Whitman adjusted his tie, his expression calm, calculated. Whitman was the kind of prosecutor who thrived in cases like this. Ones where the power dynamic was clear, where the defendant had little chance of fighting back. Judge Warren Langford entered, his face as unreadable as stone. The bailiff called for order. Whitman rose, smoothing his suit before addressing the court. Your Honor, the state is prepared to move forward with the charges against Mr. Greaves. He turned slightly, addressing the jury, though they wouldn't be needed for this hearing. The defendant was detained for resisting a lawful order and is linked to an ongoing narcotics investigation. Malcolm barely reacted, though he felt Leo stiffen beside him. Leo stood. Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is built on speculation. The prosecution has failed to provide any actual evidence linking my client to... Langford cut him off with a raised hand. Mr. Dunn, I suggest you focus on the facts. This is not a debate. Leo hesitated, then nodded stiffly. He glanced at Malcolm, frustration flickering in his eyes. Whitman, emboldened by the judge's support, continued. The defendant's vehicle was identified as matching the description of a car involved in an ongoing investigation. Given the circumstances, his resistance to law enforcement raises reasonable suspicion. Leo exhaled, trying to steady himself. Your Honor, reasonable suspicion is not proof. Mr. Greaves was compliant until he was forcibly detained without probable cause. The officers had no justifiable reason to escalate the situation to an arrest. Whitman smirked. That's one interpretation. Leo turned to the judge, voice firm despite the weight pressing against him. Your Honor, we request that Mr. Greaves be released on bail while this case is reviewed properly. Malcolm watched as Langford barely even pretended to consider it. Request denied, the judge said. The defendant will remain in custody pending further investigation. The gavel came down. Just like that, it was decided. As the guards moved toward him, Malcolm stole a glance at the back of the courtroom. There sat Sergeant Roy Beckett, relaxed, legs crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. The message was clear. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about power. And Malcolm was starting to realize just how much of it had already been wielded against him. Leo paced the small holding room, his brow furrowed in frustration. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, artificial glow over the stark walls. Across from him, Malcolm sat with his hands clasped together on the table, his expression unreadable. Leo exhaled sharply. I don't get it. This was supposed to be a simple misidentification. They claim your car matched a suspect's vehicle. Fine, mistakes happen. But why the hell are they pushing so hard to keep you locked up? Malcolm remained silent for a moment, watching the young lawyer. Then, in a slow, deliberate tone, he said, "Because this isn't a mistake." Leo stopped pacing. What do you mean? Malcolm leaned forward slightly. I mean, I'm not just some random guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a pause before he continued, his voice even. I'm Malcolm Greaves, federal prosecutor. Leo blinked. Wait, you're with the DOJ? Malcolm nodded. For over 20 years. The weight of those words settled in the room. Leo ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken. Jesus, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to see how this would play out, Malcolm said calmly. And now I know it's not just about a traffic stop. Leo dropped into the chair across from him. You think they know who you are? Malcolm's gaze darkened. Not when they arrested me, but someone does now. And that means this wasn't just some overzealous cop having a bad night. This was deliberate. Leo swallowed hard. So, what the hell is going on? Malcolm glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone. Then he said, Beckett. Leo frowned. Sergeant Beckett? Malcolm nodded. That smirk in the courtroom? That wasn't the look of a man making a routine arrest. That was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Leo leaned forward, his mind racing. You think he set you up? I think he's involved in something bigger, Malcolm said. And if I had to guess, my arrest was about keeping me out of the way. That night, Leo couldn't shake the unease creeping into his bones. He sat in his car outside the detention center, laptop open, sifting through reports. He knew something about this case didn't add up. Now he needed proof. He pulled up traffic camera footage from the intersection where Malcolm had been stopped. The timestamp was just minutes before the arrest. As he scanned the footage, his pulse quickened. There, parked half a block away from the scene, was a dark sedan. It wasn't marked, wasn't moving, just waiting. Leo frowned. He rewound the footage and played it again. The car had been there before Malcolm arrived. It hadn't followed him. It had been waiting for him. His gut twisted. This wasn't random, he murmured to himself. He needed more. The next morning, Leo took a calculated risk. Instead of heading straight to court, he drove to a small diner off the highway, a place cops frequented when they wanted to talk without being overheard. And sure enough, sitting at a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee, was Officer Ethan Doyle. Leo slid into the seat across from him. Doyle stiffened. What the hell are you doing here? I need to talk, Leo said. And you do too. Doyle hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Leo lowered his voice. I saw the footage. Someone was waiting before Malcolm was even pulled over. This wasn't a coincidence, Doyle, and you know it. Doyle's jaw clenched. Listen, Leo pressed. I think you already have doubts. You didn't look comfortable in court yesterday. Doyle exhaled sharply. I shouldn't be talking to you. Leo leaned in. Then why did you agree to meet? Silence. Then in a hushed tone, Doyle said, Something's not right. Beckett, he's been doing things that don't sit well with me. I didn't know about this case until the last second. He made the call before we even ran the plates. Leo's stomach sank. So he knew the car was Malcolm's. Doyle gave a tight nod. Leo's mind was spinning. Why target him? Doyle hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, I don't know everything, but I do know this. Beckett's name has come up in some bad places. And if he set up Greaves, it's not just about an arrest. It's about shutting him up. Leo felt a chill run down his spine. Do you have proof? Doyle glanced around, paranoid. I might, but if I go on record, you'll be protected, Leo said. Doyle scoffed. You can't promise that. Leo studied him. Then let me take what you have. I'll do the rest. Doyle looked torn. Then finally he nodded. Meet me tomorrow, midnight, the old train yard. Leo swallowed. Okay. Doyle stood abruptly and walked out. Leo sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of him. He had a lead, but he had the sinking feeling that Doyle had just put himself in danger. That night, Leo barely slept. When midnight approached, he parked his car a few blocks from the train yard and walked the rest of the way. The air was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the highway. He checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. By 12:30, Doyle still hadn't shown up. A sick feeling crept into Leo's gut. He pulled out his phone, dialing Doyle's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Then in the distance, he heard sirens. Leo turned toward the sound. The pit in his stomach deepened. Doyle was gone. Leo sat in his car outside Doyle's apartment complex, gripping his phone as he listened to the endless ringing on the other end. No answer. He had been calling for hours. Doyle was gone. Leo had already spoken to his precinct, where they claimed Doyle had taken an unplanned leave. His wife hadn't seen him. His neighbors hadn't seen him. It was as if he had disappeared overnight. His stomach twisted. If Doyle was gone for good, Malcolm would lose his best chance at proving his arrest was a setup. A wave of helplessness washed over Leo, but he pushed it down. There was still time. There had to be. He started his car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a hero. But at this point, he was the only one left to fight this battle. And he wasn't about to back down. Malcolm sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the gray cement walls of his cell. He had waited before, waited on evidence, waited on a jury's verdict. But this was different. This wasn't justice playing out. This was something else. He rubbed his temples and exhaled, then stood and walked to the door, knocking twice. The guard barely glanced at him. What? I need to make a call. The officer sighed but gestured for him to follow. Minutes later, Malcolm picked up the phone in the visitor room, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It rang longer than he expected. Then a voice. Who is this? Malcolm's grip tightened on the receiver. It's me. I need help. The line went silent. Then a sigh. You really know how to pick your moments, don't you? I don't have time for a lecture, Daniel. Daniel Price, an old friend from his early DOJ days, now embedded deep within Washington's bureaucracy. If there was anyone who could get a read on this situation, it was him. Yeah, well, you should have called me before you got yourself locked up. Not exactly something I planned. Daniel hesitated. You're in deeper than you think. I did some digging after I heard about your case. And I don't know who, but someone high up wants you out of the picture. Your name was flagged in DOJ databases a few days before your arrest. Malcolm stiffened. You're saying this wasn't just Beckett? Number this is bigger. And if I had to guess, someone is making sure you stay exactly where you are. A cold weight settled in Malcolm's chest. Daniel, I can try to slow them down, but I can't promise anything. Just watch your back, Malcolm. These people play for keeps. The line went dead. Malcolm slowly hung up the receiver. His arrest was no mistake. And if they were keeping him here, that meant they were planning something worse. He had to act before they did. That night, as Leo locked up his office, something didn't feel right. At first, it was just a feeling, an itch in the back of his mind, a faint awareness that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Then he saw it. Across the street, a black SUV sat idling, its engine low and steady. The windows were tinted, too dark to see inside, but Leo didn't need to. Someone was in there, watching, waiting. His pulse quickened. He turned, forcing himself to walk calmly toward his car, his keys clenched in his fist. The air felt heavier, the quiet city street pressing in around him. He was just reaching for the door handle when a voice cut through the night. "Done?" Leo froze. Slowly he turned. A man stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest. His suit was dark, unremarkable, the kind that blended into the background. His face was forgettable, but his presence wasn't. "Walk away," the man said, his voice even, deliberate. Leo swallowed hard. "Excuse me?" The man took a step closer. "You're getting involved in things you don't understand. Let it go." Leo's grip on his keys tightened. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "Or what?" The man smirked, a small, knowing smirk that made Leo's stomach turn. "Or you end up like Doyle." A cold rush of fear spread through Leo's veins. His breath came faster now. "What did you do to him?" The man didn't answer. He just turned, walking back toward the SUV. The vehicle's engine growled to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A moment later, it rolled down the street, disappearing into the night. Leo stood there, heart hammering. He was scared. But more than that, he was angry. Whoever they were, whatever they thought this was, they had just made a mistake. Because now he wasn't walking away. The next morning, Malcolm was escorted to court for yet another hearing, expecting nothing but more delays, more stonewalling. Then something unexpected happened. Langford cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, the court is granting the defendant's request for release on bail." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even Leo looked surprised. Malcolm, however, felt the weight of the words settle in his gut. This wasn't a victory. This was a message. They weren't worried about him anymore, because now they didn't need him alive. Leo sat hunched over his laptop, his office dimly lit except for the glow of the screen. He had spent the past 2 hours reviewing footage from the street near Doyle's apartment, his eyes scanning every frame for something, anything that could explain what happened to the missing officer. Then he saw it. At 11:32 p.m., the night Doyle was supposed to meet him, a marked patrol car slowed in front of Doyle's building. It idled for a few moments before 2 men stepped out, both in dark uniforms. One was partially obscured, but the other was Sergeant Roy Beckett. Leo's breath hitched. Doyle hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as he took screenshots of the footage, saving them to an external drive. Then he copied the license plate number of the patrol car and ran it through a public records database. There it was. The car was assigned to Beckett. Leo leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This was it. Proof that Doyle's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. Now he just needed to figure out why. And there was only one way to do that. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the lingering scent of cheap whiskey and fried food. A jukebox hummed a slow country tune in the background, and a few off-duty cops sat at the far end, nursing beers. Malcolm pushed open the door and stepped inside, scanning the room. Then he saw him. Beckett sat alone in a booth, a half-empty glass of bourbon in front of him. He didn't look up until Malcolm approached. For a split second, there was surprise in Beckett's eyes. He hadn't expected to see Malcolm out of jail so soon. But he recovered quickly, settling back into his seat with an easy smirk. "Well, well," Beckett said, swirling his drink. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you so soon, Greaves." Malcolm slid into the seat across from him. "I'm sure you didn't." Beckett chuckled. "What can I say? The justice system works in mysterious ways." Malcolm didn't smile. He leaned forward slightly. "Where's Doyle?" Beckett's smirk didn't waver. "No idea what you're talking about." Malcolm studied him. "You're a lot of things, Beckett, but you're not sloppy. You made sure there was no paper trail, no direct connection, but you forgot about the cameras." Beckett's fingers stilled against his glass. Malcolm continued, "I have footage of your patrol car outside Doyle's apartment the night he went missing." Beckett's expression hardened. "I don't think I need to remind you," Malcolm said, his voice measured, "that an officer disappearing like that, it won't just be a case of missing paperwork. People will start asking questions, and once they do, you won't be able to hide behind your badge anymore." Beckett let out a slow breath, then set his glass down. For the first time, the confidence in his eyes flickered. "There are things you don't understand, Greaves," he said, his voice lower now. Things bigger than you, bigger than me. Malcolm held his gaze. Then help me understand. Beckett leaned forward slightly. If I don't take care of you, someone else will. Malcolm didn't flinch. Who? Beckett exhaled sharply. You think I'm the one pulling the strings? You think I set all this up just to watch you squirm? Malcolm said nothing, waiting. Beckett hesitated. Then finally he said, there are people who don't like prosecutors like you poking around where they don't belong. Doyle got too close to something. That's why he's gone. And if you keep pushing, you'll be next. Malcolm clenched his jaw. You still haven't answered my question. Who are they? Beckett let out a dry chuckle. You really think I'd tell you? Malcolm leaned back. You just did. Beckett's smirk faltered. He had said too much. Malcolm didn't press further. He knew Beckett wasn't going to give him names. Not yet. But now he had confirmation that this went beyond just one corrupt cop. And that meant whoever was pulling the strings, they were powerful. Malcolm stepped into the cool night air, his thoughts moving faster than his footsteps. He needed to get this information to Leo. Now. Every second counted. If Beckett was just a piece of the puzzle, then someone else was pulling the strings. And if they didn't act fast, the truth would slip through their fingers. He had barely taken a step toward his car when a sharp metallic click cut through the quiet. A gun. His body reacted before his mind could process it, diving behind a parked car just as the shot rang out. The impact sent a violent clang through the night, the bullet striking the metal exactly where he had been standing just seconds ago. His breath came in short, steady bursts as he crouched low, pressing his back against the car door. His pulse pounded in his ears. He peered around the edge, but whoever had fired was already gone. Just a dark figure vanishing into the shadows. No hesitation, no second attempt. They weren't trying to intimidate him anymore. They were trying to eliminate him. Malcolm exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to steady as he reached for his phone. He dialed Leo. The call barely rang before Leo picked up. They just tried to take me out, Malcolm said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. Silence for half a second, then a sharp curse on the other end. Jesus, are you hit? I'm fine, Malcolm replied, scanning the street, but the assassin was long gone. But Beckett slipped up. This goes beyond him. Someone else is orchestrating this. Leo's tone shifted, all traces of hesitation gone. Then we don't wait anymore. We take this public. Malcolm nodded to himself, pushing off the car, straightening his posture. No more waiting. No more second-guessing. It was time to end this. Malcolm sat in the back seat of Leo's car, his fingers gripping a flash drive, the small device that held the key to unraveling everything. The city lights of Atlanta flickered through the window as they drove through quiet streets, heading toward a secluded parking lot behind a 24-hour diner. Sitting inside the diner was Hannah Schultz, a seasoned investigative journalist with Atlanta News 6. She had been covering police corruption for years, but now she had a story that would make everything else pale in comparison. Leo parked, glancing at Malcolm. You sure about this? Malcolm exhaled. If we go through the system, they'll bury this. We need the public to see it first. They stepped out of the car and entered the diner. The place smelled of stale coffee and fried bacon, a few late-night patrons scattered among the booths. Hannah sat in the corner, nursing a cup of black coffee, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Malcolm the second he approached. I was wondering when you'd finally reach out, she said, setting her cup down. Malcolm slid into the booth across from her, placing the flash drive on the table. Everything you need is on there. Traffic cam footage, arrest reports, and proof that Sergeant Beckett was at Doyle's apartment the night he disappeared. Hannah picked up the flash drive, weighing it in her hand. If this is as good as you say it is, I'll have it on the air by morning. Leo shifted. You might want to move fast. Someone's already tried to kill him once. Hannah's jaw tightened. Then we don't wait. She stood, stuffing the flash drive into her bag. You'll want to be watching the morning news. As she walked out, Malcolm leaned back against the booth, exhaling deeply. For the first time in days, he felt the tide turning. By 7 a.m., Atlanta News 6 aired its top story. Exclusive. Police cover-up in Malcolm Greaves' arrest. What they didn't want you to know. The broadcast detailed everything. The fabricated charges, the tampered evidence, the traffic cam footage showing Beckett's involvement in Doyle's disappearance. Clips from the footage played on screen, showing Beckett's patrol car outside Doyle's apartment. A time-stamped video proving he had lied about his whereabouts. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. Citizens demanded accountability. Civil rights groups started calling for an investigation. And when Malcolm walked into Fulton County Courthouse later that morning, the atmosphere was different. The press swarmed the steps. The public gallery was full. Reporters whispered to one another, cameras flashing as Malcolm entered. He met Leo's gaze. "We're not the only ones watching this time." The courtroom was tense. Judge Langford looked uneasy, shifting in his chair more than usual. The weight of public scrutiny was pressing down on him, and for once he couldn't pretend this was just another case. Assistant District Attorney Connor Whitman stood at the prosecution's table, his jaw tight. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. Then came the moment no one expected. Sergeant Roy Beckett was called to the stand. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Beckett walked in, his uniform pristine but his face pale. He sat stiffly, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. Leo approached. "Sergeant Beckett, were you involved in the wrongful arrest of Malcolm Greaves?" Beckett remained silent, gripping the edges of the witness stand. Leo stepped closer. "Do you deny that your patrol car was parked outside Officer Doyle's apartment the night he disappeared?" More silence. Then Beckett exhaled and spoke. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment rights." Gas rippled through the courtroom. Leo's voice was steady. "You're refusing to answer?" Beckett clenched his jaw. "That's right." Judge Langford's grip on his gavel tightened. The walls were closing in, and he knew he couldn't suppress this any longer. "Given the overwhelming evidence," Langford said, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "the court is ordering an immediate internal investigation into the conduct of Sergeant Beckett and his involvement in this case." Whitman shot up from his seat. "Your Honor," Langford cut him off. "Sit down, Mr. Whitman." Silence fell. Leo turned back to Malcolm, his lips curving into a slight smirk. They had won. As Malcolm walked out of the courthouse, the press swarmed him. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing. Hannah Schultz appeared through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Mr. Greaves, do you have any comment on today's events?" Malcolm paused, meeting her gaze. "This case was never just about me," he said. "It's about accountability, and we're not stopping here." The courtroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that only happens when the weight of reality presses down on everyone in the room. Judge Warren Langford sat behind the bench, his expression unreadable. But Malcolm knew better. This wasn't the face of a man making a noble decision. It was the face of a man with no choice left. Langford cleared his throat, eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Malcolm. "After reviewing the evidence," he began, his voice unusually tight, "and considering the new developments in this case, the court finds no legal grounds for continued prosecution. The charges against Mr. Greaves are hereby dismissed." A moment of silence. Then murmurs erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The gallery stirred with hushed conversations, and Leo let out a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. Malcolm, however, remained still. He knew this wasn't an act of justice. This was damage control. Langford wasn't setting him free because he believed in Malcolm's innocence. He was setting him free because the public now knew the truth. The judge's gavel came down, a hollow sound that signaled the end of this chapter. But Malcolm wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end of the fight. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Reporters pushed microphones forward, cameras flashed. "Mr. Greaves, how do you feel about the ruling? Do you believe this was a targeted attack against you? What are your plans now?" Malcolm gave them a measured look before answering. "This wasn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "This was about a system that allows corruption to fester. And I can promise you, this is far from over." The cameras caught every word, because this wasn't just about Malcolm Greaves anymore. As Malcolm walked down the courthouse steps, Leo fell in step beside him, scrolling through his phone. "They just took Beckett into custody," he muttered. Malcolm nodded. "Good." Sergeant Roy Beckett had finally run out of places to hide. Facing mounting evidence, he had no choice but to take a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to testify against a network of officers involved in falsified arrests, cover-ups, and even connections to organized crime. Ada Connor Whitman wasn't as lucky. By the end of the day, he had been placed on indefinite leave, pending an ethics investigation. With public outrage at its peak, the DA's office had no choice but to distance itself from him. And Langford? The Judicial Review Board had already begun investigating his long history of questionable rulings. The system had protected these men for years, but now it was turning against them. Later that night, Malcolm sat in his apartment, staring out at the Atlanta skyline. The city hummed, cars moving like veins of light through the streets. He should have felt relief, but all he felt was restlessness. This wasn't a win. It was a glimpse behind the curtain. How many others had been railroaded like he had? How many people had sat in a jail cell, waiting for justice that would never come? Malcolm had spent his career believing in the system, but now he knew better. He wouldn't just walk away from this. A week later, Leo sat across from Malcolm in a cafe, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "You know," he said, setting his spoon down, "when I took your case, I thought I was in over my head." Malcolm smirked. "You were?" Leo chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe, but now, I can't imagine doing anything else." He leaned forward. "I want to keep doing this, Malcolm, helping people who don't have a voice." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. We need more lawyers like you." Leo had changed. The hesitant, unsure attorney was gone. In his place was a man who had found his purpose. Meanwhile, Atlanta News 6 continued its relentless coverage. Hannah Schultz wasn't done. Her investigation had uncovered more than just one dirty cop. The deeper she dug, the more corruption she exposed. Soon, other cases were being reopened. Citizens demanded accountability. Activist groups rallied for change. And Malcolm Greaves' story became a rallying cry. The justice system had tried to break him. Instead, it had awakened something bigger. One morning, Malcolm stood in front of the Department of Justice building. The air was crisp, the sun casting a golden hue over the city. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A deep voice on the other end. "Mr. Greaves, I need your help. I was convicted for something I didn't do." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. Then a slow, determined exhale. He looked up at the imposing building in front of him. His battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I'll take a look at your case," he said, and with that he stepped forward. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about those who dare to stand up when the system fails. Malcolm Greaves fought back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by corruption. His story reminds us that power unchecked is power abused, and sometimes the fight for truth begins where the law ends. So what do you think? Can one person truly challenge a broken system, or is the fight too big to win? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. We have plenty more to uncover.